Okay, I'm going to start. I think I'm really pleased to see everybody. Welcome to At Home with the League. I'm Joanna Leifer. I'm the Program Committee Chair for the New York City chapter of the League of Women Voters. Every month, my program committee invites an expert speaker to discuss a social or political topic impacting New Yorkers. Today's topic deals with New York redistricting. And the question is, are we ready for the new lines? As many of you already know, New York's congressional delegation is losing one seat after the 2022 election. It was only 89 residents short, but this loss brings up many questions. Our speaker, Professor Jeff Wice, is an expert on redistricting and will present an overview on why redistricting is so important and what to expect with the new laws, timetables, and procedures. But before I introduce him, I have a few housekeeping details to go over. First of all, this presentation is being taped. So if you do not want to be on tape, please sign off now. Also, you'll notice that everyone is muted. This is because we don't want to have any ambient noise and we don't want to have our host interrupted. After this event, we will have a Q&A, but again, you will be asked to write in your questions on the side, and Professor Wice will answer them for you then. Now, before we go on any more, I want to introduce our co-president to the New York City League, Diane Burrows, who will tell you a little bit more about the League and some of our upcoming events.
Thanks,
Diane.
Joanna. Thanks, Joanna, and welcome everybody. I really just wanted to say a couple of things about what's just happened. We are, of course, waiting for final results from our New York City primary. And I have to say that here at the League, we're really proud of the efforts that we participated in terms of get out the vote. This was the best voter turnout in 20 years. I mean, it was still abysmal, but it was the best voter turnout in 20 years. And we believe that our campaigns during this primary season to educate voters about ranked choice voting really made a difference. We conducted over 60 presentations, talks to more than 3,000 people, plus postcarding, palm cards, social media, PSAs, phone calls, and several of us were even interviewed on TV news shows. So we believe that we really made a difference. I also wanted to point out, in light of tonight's special event, that the State League is going to be conducting 2 trainings on being able to participate in the redistricting efforts here. And those 2 trainings, I'll put them in the chat shortly. July 22nd at 6:30 or July 27th at noon, 12 o'clock. And you just have to go to the State League website, LWVNY, if you want to register for those trainings. And then you can register after that to testify, if you would like, when the Redistricting Commission holds its hearings coming up, also starting July 22nd in Queens. And we'll more about that later. Also, just a quick note, something that is happening this week. There will be a rally at 12 o'clock on Thursday in front of Governor Cuomo's office at 40th and 3rd in support of him signing the less is more legislation that will help folks who have been incarcerated from being reincarcerated for technical parole violations. So if you're interested in doing that, that's happening at noon at 40th and 3rd. Also, just lastly, congratulations. And I see Paulette is here. I don't know if Jane Colvin is here. Paulette Austin, Jane Colvin, and Sarah Hirsch, 3 of our members, have just been appointed by the National League as UN observers. And this is a really important role for National League. Historically, we get to, or I should say our delegates or our observers get to make formal written and oral statements to the United Nations and are consulted on issues related to issues that are in our powerhouse. So congratulations, Paulette and Jane and Sarah. Thank you, Joanna.
Okay. Thank you, Diane. That's a lot of very good information. I'm really pleased to hear about this. So we've done a lot, and I'm glad that we have members who are very involved. Now we're going to get ready for our presentation, and I'm really thrilled to introduce our speaker, whose name is Jeff Wice. He is an adjunct professor and senior fellow at New York Law School. He has over 40 years of experience working in redistricting, voting rights, and census law. And he is considered a national expert on redistricting. So we're very lucky to have him here today. He has also been included in the publication Roll Call, which lists the top 50 Washington policy insiders. Professor Wice has assisted many state legislative leaders, members of Congress, and other state and local government officials on redistricting and voting rights matters across the nation. Professor Wice served as counsel to the Democratic National Committee and other national redistricting projects. In New York, he served as a longtime counsel to the New York State Legislature and has assisted in all congressional and state legislative redistricting processes since the 1980s, which is awesome. That's a long time. It shows a real expert. So without further ado or any more introductions, I would like to introduce Professor Jeff Wice. Thank you. You have to unmute yourself, Jeff.
I guess I got muted by the group. Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you tonight. I'm going to walk you through the New York State redistricting process, which is an entirely new one from the way redistricting has been done for the last, I'll say, a few centuries that New York has drawn lines. I'm going to use a PowerPoint, so I'm going to take a second to manipulate the share screen and bring up my PowerPoint, which you should see a puzzle in front of you. I see heads shaking. Okay, so that worked. So let me adjust my screen. So hopefully after the next few minutes are over, you won't be as confused as this gentleman is in terms of trying to figure out the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle. I'll start with just discussing briefly, why does redistricting matter? Why is this so important? It's been known as everything from the blood sport of American politics to a backroom manipulation that no one really pays attention to. But for those of you who were involved with the 2020 census last year, we talked all about how important the census is for transportation, education, senior services, all kinds of funding. And this is more or less, Act 2 of the census process. The lines that are drawn this year for Congress and the state legislature and next year for the city council will determine who represents you in Washington, in Albany, and in City Hall, and how the decisions will get made that will deliver programs and dollars to your communities. Now, I said last year during the census taking, look outside your window, the hospitals, the schools, the streets, the senior centers, the youth services. Are you satisfied with what your community is receiving now? What needs improvement? And that's what redistricting gets down to. It's who represents you, who are the decision makers, and like the census numbers last for a decade, the district lines, barring any kind of a court challenge throwing them out, which has never happened in New York in a very long time. These lines will be in place for 10 years. Now, just to very quickly recap and remind you about the census. The census numbers are used to drive about 300 federal programs. Of those 300 programs, 16 of them distribute money based on a per capita or per person basis. Programs such as school lunch, Section 8 housing, transportation programs. There are 16 of them all in all. And for those per capita programs, New York received $53 billion. That breaks down to about $2,687 per person. That's just for 16 programs. There are well over 300 others, which means that although we can't pin a price tag on it per person, each of us benefits by thousands more dollars coming from Washington. Now, when we look at the US Constitution, Article 1, Section 2, it requires that a census be taken for the original purpose of apportioning congressional districts among the states. And New York has had one of the largest delegations over the years. The largest delegation size was during World War II, from the 1930s through the 1950 census, when New York State had 45 members in the House. Today, New York has 27 members. That's the same number New York had in the 1820s. And New York is continuing to lose congressional districts, not as much because the state's population hasn't grown, but because other states in the South, in the West, have picked up more population. New York State gained population due to the immigrant community coming in between 2010 and 2016. But unfortunately, when Donald Trump closed the nation's gates to new immigration, the population increase stopped and New York lost numbers. What's intriguing us, and we're not going to know the answer until we get the census data I'll discuss in a few moments in August, is that the state population increased by 4% from 2010 to 2020. Now, as the Census Bureau projected that New York gained population for each of the years 2010 through 2016, and projected that New York lost population from 2017 to 2020, there's a big question mark hanging over us. And we'll have the answers when the Census Bureau delivers the granular block by block data that's used to redraw the lines on August 16th. New York, as we heard, will lose one congressional district after 2020, from 27 members down to 26. When I first worked for the Assembly, when Stanley Fink was Speaker in 1980, New York lost 5 congressional districts. That's a national single-decade loss. New York lost 3 districts after 1990, lost 2 districts after 2010 and 2000 and 2010, but now only 1 district after 2020. And we learned that New York lost that district, or actually could have saved it, had 89 people more been counted. Now, where things stand with that is that you simply can't add 89 people to the New York count and leave the other 49 states where they are. There's a much bigger dynamic at stake. Minnesota kept the district by only 23 people. And if you touch New York's numbers, you're going to have a whole domino effect. Plus, federal law prohibits the changing of the apportionment once it's been certified by the president, the Secretary of Commerce, and then submitted to the states for the actual line drawing process. Just to give you a sense of the size of these districts, New York's 27 districts that we have now, these are the New York City districts, and you can see that they're quite large in the land that they cover. These districts have about 17,000 people each. With the 63 state Senate districts, they're smaller, about 130 some odd thousand people per district. And you can see those lines here. For the state assembly, where there are 150 districts statewide, and I think about 60 districts in New York City. They're even smaller at about 130,000 people per district. So where are we now that the census has been taken, and what's going on? Well, no one predicted that the pandemic, which hit us about March 13th, March 15th last year, only 2 weeks before the official start of the census taking period, well, everything basically shut down. The census counting operation really didn't pick up in earnest again until 2 months later in May. We all saw Donald Trump's effort to adjust the census numbers, first by adding a citizenship question, which the Supreme Court said could not be added because it wasn't added in the right manner. But that also put a chilling effect on people's responses and interest in the census. But it really put a damper on things. But also because the census taking went from April and then stopped and picked up again in May and was extended till October, the data to use for redistricting was also delayed. The congressional apportionment should have been announced December 30th or December 31st by statute. Because of the delays, the Census Bureau couldn't provide that data until April 26th. Now, a few definitions and a few numbers to give you the big picture. Reapportionment is the simple process of reallocating congressional districts among the 50 states. It's based on a 1940s era federal statutory formula. Each state is allocated one district, and the remaining 51 to 435 are allocated based on something called the method of equal proportions. It's a complicated algorithmic formula that Congress approved in 1941. Redistricting is different, and redistricting is the actual line drawing within a state or within a city of the district boundaries. So reapportionment essentially reapportions or reallocates 435 districts among 50 states, whereas redistricting is the actual line drawing as to where the lines are drawn for Congress, the Assembly, the Senate, and next year for the City Council. The data that's used for redistricting is referred to as PL 94-171 data. And this data will be provided to the states. They're calling it the legacy data on August 16th. That essentially means that they're going to send each state a suitcase full of data, unsorted, and it's going to take specialists to decipher, figure out how to use the data in the computers to draw lines. But they wanted to get something in the hands of state officials as soon as they could, and they determined that the raw data could be provided to states who know how to use it by August 16th. The user-friendly version of the data that usually goes out to states on April 1st and was delayed because of the pandemic, that's actually going to be in chart form. It's going to be explained. It's going to have additional material, but the August 16th data and the September 30th data will be the same exact numbers. Now, on our congressional, Senate, and Assembly districts, we're going down to 26 districts. The 27 districts we have now have 717,000 people each. The new average population for congressional districts will increase to 748,200 people. And state Senate districts, there are 63 districts, which now include roughly 310,000 people each. The new number will be 320,650. And for the state assembly, for those 150 districts, there are now about 130,000 people per district. And that number will increase to about 134,670 people. Now, here you see the basic laws that govern redistricting. The first is, and the most important, one person, one vote, is the US Constitution. And that requires that each legislative district be basically the same in population from one to the other within a state or within a city. Now, it's important to note that the courts have set different standards for what one person, one vote means. There's one standard for Congress and another for the legislature and all other bodies. Essentially, for Congress, the Supreme Court has ruled that every district within a state must be of equal population. That means that the largest district and the smallest district can't vary by literally more than one person. It's hard to believe, but when states had legal challenges in 1990 over this, the courts said, yes, we mean one person. And that, to a degree, causes some of the irregular shapes that you see in the district lines, because you can't simply draw by neighborhood. You have to draw by exact numbers. For the state legislature and for the city council, there's a different standard, and that's where the populations of assembly and senate districts can vary by up to 10% from the size of the largest to the size of the smallest districts. In New York City, up until 2012, because of the old state constitution, every assembly district and every senate district within each borough of New York City had to be equal, yet the populations from Brooklyn to Queens, or from Queens to the Bronx, or from Queens to Erie County or Albany County could vary by up to 10%. So from the ideal population, they could be plus or minus 5 or plus 7 minus 3. There's more flexibility, and that's still the law today. The second major law is the Federal Voting Rights Act. And the Federal Voting Rights Act, under Section 2, requires that new district lines, or really any voting act, cannot dilute minority voting strength if certain situations prevail. You've all probably heard about the Supreme Court decision, Brinovich versus Democratic National Committee, that came down a week or two ago. That decision dealt mostly with election laws and procedures. It did not touch redistricting. For redistricting, you are required to create an effective minority district, meaning that you have to have 50% plus minority voting age population if you can show that, number one, the minority voting age community, it makes up a majority of a model district, 50% plus of minority voters. Second, you've got to demonstrate that the voters vote similarly or cohesively. In Miami, Florida, you can't draw a district that joins Puerto Ricans and Cubans, because their voting patterns show that Puerto Ricans vote Democratic and Cubans vote Republican. You have to show cohesiveness. And third, most importantly, you have to show that the white majority votes consistently to deny the minority its ability to elect preferred candidates. And during the 1980s, this at the state legislative and congressional level was a major player, because white voters in New York City were still the predominant voters, and African-American, Hispanic, and Asian voters had much lower turnout numbers, so that there was a degree of polarized voting, which we don't see as much today as we have in the past. Up until 2013, there was a second factor under the Voting Rights Act, which applied to Brooklyn, New York, and Bronx counties, and that was called Section 5. Section 5 required that for counties, jurisdictions within states that had a very low minority vote turnout, plus some kind of a literacy test or poll tax to vote, that those jurisdictions could not enact new redistricting plans or any other kind of election law change without pre-approval by either the Justice Department or a federal court in Washington, D.C. That meant for redistricting that any plan that covered the Bronx, Brooklyn, or New York counties had to be pre-cleared by Washington before they can go into effect. In 2013, in the Holder versus Shelby Supreme Court decision, the Supreme Court held that the formula used to cover jurisdictions was dated back to the 1960s and was no longer ripe for governing who should be covered under the law in the 21st century. There's an effort now in Congress to enact the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. And that's something that Congress is expected to take up later this year, which would reinstate this kind of pre-clearance approval process. But for the purposes of this year's congressional and state legislative redistricting, Section 5 no longer applies. The next factor, and the one I'll spend most of my remaining time on, is the New York State Constitution, which was amended by the voters in 2014 to create both a new redistricting commission to advise the legislature, and also that sets up certain criteria that had not been in place before that the commission has to follow. The major issues that the commission of the state are going to have to look at are compliance with the state constitution, which could be quite complicated, to comply with the Voting Rights Act, to avoid minority vote dilution where that's applicable, also to avoid racial gerrymandering, which is where you draw districts that have too many minority voters that won't allow them to impact elections in neighboring communities. We also have the issue of partisan gerrymandering, where plans are drawn to benefit one political party over another. In 2019, the Supreme Court held that federal courts are not they're not in place to adjudicate partisan battles, that there's no way to tell or gauge what a partisan gerrymander is. But state courts can entertain these kinds of claims using freedom of association or freedom of speech or right to vote standards found in many state constitutions, including New York's. And then we also have in New York usual minor procedural challenges. In 2012, there was a challenge to the increasing the size of the state Senate, a challenge to the state's prisoner gerrymandering law, which I'll talk about. And there was a challenge earlier this year over funding, over the governor's inability to fund the commission, which now finally has its funding. Now, a few final things on the data. The PL 94-171 block data I mentioned that's used for redistricting, that provides data based on census blocks. And a census block is somewhat equivalent to the size of an election district. And that data is provided by age, ethnicity, and race. That data is fed into high-speed software that costs about $10,000 a license to purchase, although there is free software available that non-professionals can use to draw maps, and I might be able to talk about that later. And the lines have been drawn for the last 40 years by LAT4. LAT4 stands for the Legislative Advisory Task Force on Reapportionment. That's a body created in 1978 as an agency or task force of the state legislature, which up until 2012 drew the lines for the Assembly and the Senate to consider. Now we have the New York State Commission, and that commission's job is to recommend plans to the legislature. I listed here actually the names of some of the free software. You can just Google these: District Builder, Dave's Redistricting, Representable, and District R. And these are websites you can go to, and there's instruction and data there so you can actually draw lines yourself. And the New York Commission, by the way, if you play with these free software programs, will accept maps for small community areas, ranging from just one district all the way to a statewide suggestion. Now, here is the New York State Independent Redistricting Commission, and it is independent in legal name only because it does report, so to speak, to the legislature, which has final approval or rejection over the plans drawn by the commission. There are 10 members of the commission. It's important to note that there is no tie-breaking 11th member. You'll see here that there are 8 members appointed by the legislative leaders. Speaker Carl Hastie has appointed Elaine Frazier from Albany and Eugene Benger, a Manhattan-based attorney. Senate President Andrea Stewart Cousins has appointed John Flateau, well known to many people in Brooklyn, as a longtime political science and election pro, someone I've been working with for over 40 years. And then also David Imamura, who's a Manhattan-based Westchester resident, appointed by Andrea Stewart Cousins as well, and coincidentally belongs to the same law firm as Speaker Hasty's appointment by no design or plan in advance, but by coincidence. On the Republican side, the Republican minority leader appointed John Conway, who is a former longtime Senate staff member, and as the vice chair of the commission, Jack Martins, a former senator from Nassau County. On the Assembly minority side, the leader, Will Barclay, there appointed Charlie Nesbitt, a former legislative leader himself, and Willis Steffens, who spent many years in the Albany, elected from Westchester County. Now, these 8 members then met and selected 2 additional members, neither of whom can belong to one of the 2 major political parties. So they picked Dr. Ivelisse Cuevas Molina, who is an independent voter and teaches political science at Fordham University. And the commissioners also picked Ross Brady, who was a Conservative Party member, ran for Congress as a conservative a few years ago, and has been the administrator at the Union Temple in Brooklyn. So those are the 10 members of the commission. They recently elected David Imamura to serve as the chair, and vice chair, although not a requirement in the state constitution, appointed Jack Martins to be the vice chair. The legislature appropriated in the current fiscal year 21-22 budget $4 million for the commission to operate through next March. And they've selected 2 co-executive directors, Karen Blatt, who worked in the Assembly, and Doug Brickell, who worked for the Senate. These are the factors, the so-called criteria that the commission has to follow. The first 2 I've already covered: population equality, 1 person, 1 vote, and compliance with the Federal Voting Rights Act. The other criteria include compactness. That means districts should be relatively round or rectangular or square, but not have 55 or 80 different jagged edges to them, or go out meandering in all kinds of different directions. Contiguity means you should be able to go from one part of a district to another without leaving the district. And contiguity means also that you can connect land masses by water if there's a ferry, a tunnel, or a bridge. Communities of interest is another criteria, and that's really the most fastest growing criteria, because communities of interest are really whatever you define them yourselves. Generally, communities of interest follow socioeconomic patterns, educational, business, religious, ethnic. As yesterday's commission hearing, a press conference announcing their hearings mentioned, if you belong to a church and the church community, the membership is divided into 3 different districts, well, that's not a community of interest. You want to put the district together into 1 district so that you are a community of interest within 1 district. You also want to follow jurisdictional boundaries. That won't apply as much in New York City as it will in counties, towns, and cities upstate New York and on Long Island. There's also a criteria not to unnecessarily pair incumbents of the same or other parties together, and also a directive not to unfairly favor or disfavor one political party over another. Now, there are over a half dozen criteria listed here. The first 2 are federal, so they've got to follow those 2. And it's a given that population equality is number 1 and Voting Rights Act compliance is number 2. But compactness, contiguity, communities of interest, there's no prioritization to these criteria. So there's no saying that the commission or the legislature can say, well, we think that we want to keep the cores of current districts intact. We want to avoid pairing incumbents. So by doing that, well, we can't quite take care of our communities of interest. And that one of the things the hearings will bring out, is how New Yorkers might find that in places like Queens, the South Asian community may be divided into 3 or 4 different legislative districts, and they might want to be all in one district. And the yin yang here is that if you follow one criteria, there's a trade-off. If you draw a district based on communities of interest, well, you might end up pairing 2 or 3 incumbents, but you can please everybody with every set of criteria. The New York City Council, however, which I won't get into in depth tonight, or probably not won't have time at all, that'll be a topic for discussion next year, does require that criteria be prioritized in a certain order and followed. So if you do 1, 2, 3, 4, that might make it impossible to do 5, 6, and 7, but you have legal backup for doing so. Here, it's basically you can please everybody, so do the best you can or think you can. Now, here's where things get a little bit complicated, so please bear with me. The commission announced yesterday that before it gets the data in August, they're going to hold 8 virtual hearings during July and August. The hearings in New York City, so you can write these down, include one on Queens, 2 o'clock on July 22nd, one covering the Bronx and New York counties on July 26th, and then a third hearing on July 29th covering Brooklyn and Staten Island. These are all virtual, being done by Zoom, and they all start at 2 o'clock p.m. And when I complete my presentation, I'll put the commission website address in the chat box. You can see, have a connection yourself. So we have hearings. The commission has to follow the criteria. And then with the schedule and what they have to do, the commission has to submit at least has to submit sets of plans to the legislature. Under current law, the commission is supposed to submit congressional, state legislative, and Senate maps, Assembly, Senate, and congressional maps to the legislature by January 1st, with a grace period of up to January 15th. And then if the legislature rejects that map or the governor vetoes it, that's just important to note, and I'll say this once, the Democrats now have supermajorities in both chambers. They can override a veto. Although the governor has the right to approve or veto a plan, a veto could be overridden. No New York governor since Franklin Roosevelt has ever vetoed a plan, and that was 1931. If the legislature does reject the first round of maps, first set of maps, then the commission goes back and submits a second set of maps. But again, if the legislature rejects the second set, on the third go around, then the legislature can do whatever it deems necessary to draw a plan of its own. And all of these plans have to be in place for the 2022 elections, meaning that the commission and the legislature have to wrap things up by most likely the end of January of next year, so that the spring primary petitioning can start in late February or early March. Here are some of the dates for the timeline. September 30th, August 16th, the commission will receive the data to draw the lines. They're only going to have 3 to 4 months to develop plans, down from the 9 months that had been originally envisioned in the Constitution, but changed because of the pandemic. The commission is supposed to, after these listening tour hearings in July and August, have its first set of plans made public on September 15th or shortly thereafter, as best they can. Now, a question has to be asked whether the commission will be able to reach consensus on a plan. And we'll have to wait and see. But if they do have a plan, then 30 days later, probably by mid-October to or early November, they've got to go out and hold a second round of hearings, at least 12 hearings, and they're listed in the state constitution. For New York City purposes, they've got to hold one separate hearing each in each of the 5 boroughs. And these maps must be debated and agreed to by the commission before they could be sent to the legislature for approval. Now, under the current voting system in the commission, it was designed to ensure that the minority party's voice counts. To do so, there are 10 commissioners. To approve a plan at the commission level, you have to get 7 of the 10 commission members to approve a proposed district plan. That means that at least one appointee from each of the 4 legislative leaders must vote to approve a proposal. That means the Democrats, Republicans both have to support the plans. And if they cannot agree on a plan, then the state constitution calls for submitting the plan or plans with the greatest number of votes. That's if they take votes. And that there's going to be a pending, there's a constitutional amendment pending before voters in November that I'll discuss a bit more. That's going to change the way the commission vote approval is structured. In the past, the Assembly and Senate bills always had to be in the same, the plans had to be in the same bill. There's an option in the Constitution that the congressional plan can be added to the Assembly and Senate plan, but it's got to be submitted to the legislature by January 1st and as late as January 15th. But because of the change in the primary from September to June, the pending amendment that you'll be voting on in November sets the first deadline with no leeway to January 1st. The legislature, as I mentioned, has the option to consider also the congressional bill in the same one with the Assembly and Senate. And then the legislature can approve the first plan without any amendments, then send it to the governor to approve or veto. If the legislature rejects the first plan or the governor vetoes it, or he's overridden if he does veto it, the commission must then submit a second plan to the legislature by February 28th. Now, February 28th is likely to be later than when petitioning for the new district starts in late February or early March. So the pending constitutional amendment would change the deadline for the second plan to January 15th. And if the second plan, if it gets that far, is rejected by the legislature, then the legislature can amend the second plan, as the Constitution says, as it deems necessary, which essentially means that the legislature can draw any plan it wants. And that plan also goes to the governor for approval. But for the first time, I think since possibly 1911, Democrats have supermajorities in both chambers. And Democrats only controlled the legislature prior to 2 years in the 1930s and 2 years in the 1960s in 1911. And that's it in our state's 200 plus history. And as I think I mentioned, only Franklin Roosevelt vetoed a legislative plan when he was the Democratic governor with a Republican legislature in 1931. Now, different rules apply within the Assembly and Senate itself to vote on commission plans. Now, right now we have one-party control for both chambers. So the Constitution requires that at least 2/3 of the members of each chamber vote to approve a plan. But again, Democrats now have that 2/3 supermajority. The Constitution was written to also say that if there had been divided control, had the Republicans kept the Senate majority, then you simply had to have a majority of the legislators elected to each chamber vote to approve a plan. And again, these provisions will also be changed by the pending constitutional amendment. To finish off the process, the amendment, the current constitutional amendment provides for simple state court review of a challenge to a redistricting plan. But the new twist is that the trial court only has 60 days to decide the case. Then it could also be appealed to the appellate division and to the Court of Appeals. And should any plan be thrown out by a court for whatever reason, it goes back to the legislature, not to the commission for redrawing. Now, one thing that was left out of the 2014 amendment was the issue of prison gerrymandering. That's the practice where district lines had been drawn, including prisoners at the prison locations where they've been incarcerated. And that was seen as basically filling upstate rural districts with inmates who had no connection to those communities, that were counted only for the purposes of redistricting and inflating the real populations of those districts. So in 2010, the legislature enacted a law that would reallocate prisoners back to their homes of record prior to incarceration. So the current lines that we have today for the Assembly and Senate reflect population adjustment that reallocated about 50,000 prisoners from their upstate prisons back to their basically urban city-centered home census blocks where they were before going to prison. That was left out of the 2014 amendment, and over concern that some members of the commission might object to reallocating prisoners again. The pending amendment would reallocate prisoners and make that part of the state constitution, but also add that provision for congressional districts as well. We did not reallocate prison populations for congressional districts in 2012 because we weren't quite sure if the courts would permit that, but subsequently the federal courts in Maryland have upheld prison reallocation for congressional districts as well. Here, in a nutshell, are the basic provisions of the amendment, which you all be asked to vote on in November. First, it sets a requirement that any 7 commission members are necessary to approve a plan. It sets January 1st as the deadline for the first plan. If that's rejected by the legislature, January 15th as the deadline for the second plan. To approve a commission plan, you need simply a simple majority in the Assembly and the Senate. If the commission fails to develop a plan of its own, then you need 60% in each of the Assembly and the Senate, something that the Democrats have in both chambers. This amendment was first passed in 2020 before the Democrats had any idea that Democrats would pick up supermajorities in both chambers last November. So essentially, the Democrats will have control over the process through the current legislature. The amendment also sets the size of the state Senate at 63 districts. For each of the last decade, for the last 40 years, the then Senate Republican majority increased its membership by 1 district per decade to compensate for population losses upstate by giving themselves an extra district. So the amendment would set the size of the Senate at 63. The amendment also eliminates the requirement that there be partisan co-executive directors. It also ends the prison gerrymandering practice by making that law part of the state constitution. I'll skip over some of this. Here are some of the things that I think you'll probably learn more in depth at the League's own workshop that we heard being offered on the 22nd and the 27th. To learn the process, follow the commission's work, testify before the commission, write to the commission, send letters to the editor, and hold informational meetings very similar to what we're doing tonight. I'll leave this to the League's own webinars for later in the month. And I will skip over New York City Council redistricting. And for anybody with any questions for me later on, here is my email address. So I see we have at least 13 questions or comments in the queue. So I'm going to close the share screen and use the remainder of my time to answer your questions. And I'll
Thank
start.
you. I first want to just say thank you so much for all that informative information. And yeah, people seem to be really excited about this. We've gotten about 50 people now. I started out with fewer people, and we're suddenly being deluged with more and more people coming in to hear you. So there should be lots of questions, and I will let you choose your own questions to answer, and very interested to hear.
Okay, so I'll start at the top here. Well, glad to have Assembly Member Bishot Hermelian with us tonight. I see there's a link about the other trainings. Just keep scrolling down. Somebody put in the IRC website. Thank you, Nikki Yearwood. Okay, here's a question. Are incarcerated people counted in the community of the prison or their home address? Well, the way it works is that the Census Bureau counts people at their prison locations during the census counting process last year. What happens under the reallocation process is that the legislature's LAT4 task force gets the list and the address list and names and racial ethnic identification of each inmate, and then relocates that prison address back to the home census block of where the inmate was prior to incarceration. Now, there have been efforts in Congress to change the way prisoners are counted by the Census Bureau, but that failed to gain any traction in Congress during the 2010s, and the Census Bureau continues to count prisoners at the prisons. That could change for 2030. That's how it works right now. Okay, can participants access this recording later? I'll hope so, but Joanna? Can you answer that? You're on mute.
I'm on.
You're okay. We hear you now. No, you're back on mute.
Yes, this is being recorded, so you can listen to the whole thing or see the whole thing all over again. And if you have additional questions, you now have Professor Wice's email.
Okay. Next question from Laura Quigg. Hello, Laura. Can you explain differential privacy and how you think its use will affect the enforcement of the Voting Rights Act or anything else? Well, differential privacy, you've all probably never heard of, but that is a methodology the Census Bureau uses to protect the confidentiality of people's responses. Essentially, what the Census Bureau is attempting to do is to add people into and take people out of each census block so that a hacker can't identify a census block with 100% of its information still in place. The concern is that, I'll just be very hypothetical here, if you have a census block of 100 people, 90 are, let's say 80% are white, 10% are Black, and 10% are Hispanic, and you arbitrarily take 15 people out and put 8 people in, well, are those going to be white, Black, Hispanic? And because the Voting Rights Act requires that you have 50% plus minority voting age population, then differential privacy might weaken, lower the true population of a piece of census geography. This is really a subterranean fight that's been going on, but there have been analyses done in New York, primarily in New Rochelle for the city council, that demonstrated that by adding differential privacy to the New Rochelle population, you're eliminating minority city council districts. So it's a big concern. There was a court challenge to it. The state of Alabama challenged it in court, and 2 weeks ago, the federal court held, basically punting, saying that it's too early to tell if there's harm or not. Basically, the court said, don't ask us now, come back later if you can allege actual harm. The second area where differential privacy could be harmful is for one person, one vote. When you draw congressional districts at 740,000 people per district, and you can't vary by one person, you don't know if differential privacy added or subtracted people to those real numbers. And if you're trying to both accommodate the precise population equality requirement and you're trying to keep a community intact, it could be a challenge. This is an ongoing battle where well-intentioned but totally in the clouds scientists at the Census Bureau concocted this program, and when the redistrictors became aware of it, have been, and also statisticians, real experts who've done this before are quite concerned. I don't have a real answer beyond that because we simply don't know yet, but it's something to keep an eye on. See another question from Laura. Where have you seen from other states that might help us understand how this process plays out? Well, each state's laws are different. You have at one end, California, where the entire process is independent of the legislature, where the independent state auditor picks from a pool of hundreds of people, a final pool of 15 people to serve on a commission balanced between independents, Republicans, and Democrats. And they were completely independent of the legislature and the governor. And the plan that they enact becomes the final plan. Now, at the other end of where legislators themselves draw the lines, I'll use the example of Massachusetts, where in 2010 and in 2020, the legislature, I'm sorry, 2000 and 2010, the legislature did a major outreach program, was very inclusive, and drew more minority districts, and for Democratic state, more Republican districts. It's a plan that split fewer communities, that was pretty much applauded by the good government community and the voting rights community as being a good way to redistrict. Now, in New York, I've worked for 5 assembly speakers, 4 Democratic Senate leaders in the last 4 decades. Every decade, the assembly plan has not really been challenged. Once the Republicans challenged it in 1991 over partisan gerrymandering and lost. The Senate lines that were enacted in each of the last, I'll say 5, 6 decades have been, in my view, heavily gerrymandered. If you look at the Queens district lines, several districts in Brooklyn, there's no rhyme, reason, or rationale to them. I was part of the Senate Democratic litigation team working with the Asian American Legal Defense Fund, the Medgar Evers Center for Social Justice, and with Latino Justice to fight those lines. But the federal courts in New York have said that it's not their place to second guess the work of the legislature. So no plan in New York has been rejected by a court, despite allegations of partisanship, of whatever else you might say. But New York courts at both the federal and state level have been hesitant to reject a state legislative redistricting plan. But I'm going to put in the website the address for the National Conference of State Legislatures. And if you Google redistricting there, they've got a ton of stuff that can show you how the process works in other states. Another question, how will we get the census data to upload into these softwares? How can we compare the data from 10 years ago? Well, working with the data from 10 years ago, you really need to have advanced software. Usually the individual contract for the software that's used costs about $10,000. The free software websites let you actually use the new data to draw districts, but doesn't really reflect you back to the old districts. But to be on point on answering your question, the City University of New York Mapping Service plans to put up a website that will show you on a comparison screen basis, left side, right side, the old district, the current districts from 2012, and the new districts once they're proposed. So you could actually, for your own district, let's say, look at your current lines. You can see on their website the population, the racial breakdown, and then see the difference from the proposed plans of this year. I can't do it right now, but I can send you the link to the 2010 version that will show you how you can compare 2000 with 2010 lines. But otherwise, I would suggest looking at the free software and trying to just develop lines from what you know is the current plan to a new plan. It gets to be a complicated process at that end, but the CUNY Graduate Center Mapping Service is going to do its best to provide that for you. Okay, and then I think the last question I see here from Ruth Mullen is, how would what would be the criteria for communities of interest? Well, as I mentioned, communities of interest could be whatever you make of them. You can argue that a community of interest, for instance, the Upper East Side versus the Upper West Side, or looking at, I mean, I'm familiar with Sunset Park in Brooklyn. That is a community of interest that it's argued divides the Asian American community into two districts. When you look at several of the assembly districts in Queens, the Asian American Legal Defense Fund argues that in Ozone Park, in Elmhurst, in Jackson Heights, the Asian American community is divided into 3, 4, 5 different districts. I talked to one assembly member today who has a predominantly white and Jewish and South Asian community. The South Asian community defines themselves as a community of interest, and they want to be together. But they also have a non-Asian incumbent legislator who, to the north of him, has a highly underpopulated district represented by a fellow, white legislator, and to the south of him are several Black and Hispanic legislators. So there's a whole, once we get the data, we'll see what the numbers allow. But the community of interest is really whatever you define it to be with factual data. I had a conversation today with the community in Brooklyn where they say that they are bounded in a square or rectangular area along Ocean Parkway, that they have churches or synagogues that are very similar, that they have grocery stores, that there are seniors, there are social service centers that specialize in a specific community. So you have to basically find a way with as much data as you can to identify what you think a community of interest is. And if you Google redistricting and community of interest, I'm sure you'll be able to come up. You'll see lots of websites that discuss this. I'm actually speaking on communities of interest at a conference of state legislators in Salt Lake City on Thursday, if anyone else is out there then. But it's a complicated question because it's self-defined. And what might be a community of interest to me is not one to you. I had a conversation with a friend in Queens who said that the South Asian community lives on both sides of the Van Wyck Expressway, but the people on the east side and the west side of the Van Wyck Expressway may be of the same ethnic origin, but they don't know each other. They don't know their stores. They don't know their churches. They don't have anything to that 6-lane highway with the Metro rail in the middle really divides what someone from the outside might say, oh, look, here are one big community of South Asian Americans, but they don't know each other and locally would not define themselves as a community of interest. And my last question, new one, or am I taking a public position on the proposal? Well, publicly, no, I don't have a public position on it, but I did help the drafters with the language. I do think that it has more positive gain in it, that I've never seen a state constitution single out for favoritism a political party as the current plan does. So speaking personally, I'm here on behalf of New York Law School. We are nonpartisan, but I think that the amendment has more good in it than some of the criticism I've seen, which basically takes away the ability of the Republican minority to veto a plan. But I don't think, as Common Cause and NYPIRG agree with me, that you should single out a political party caucus within a legislature to have certain powers. No other state constitution, and certainly not no other law in New York does what the current law includes.
Okay, is that all there is?
I'm also going to put in the chat box now a primer that I just published. It's about a 5-6 page primer on the current process so you can better understand it. There's one more question here. Can respecting incumbency produce problems like not giving enough choice to voters in a face-off long-serving legislators? Well, respecting incumbents, there are some incumbents. I know one legislator who's been in office for literally 50 years, He is as progressive as you can imagine. For the 50 years he's been there, as anyone else who claims to be a progressive. There are legislators that I've worked for who were there too. My first assembly speaker, Stanley Steingut, his father was speaker, he was speaker. They served 50 years in the assembly. And finally, the voters said, we've had enough. And he lost a primary to a challenger in 1978. So it really depends on how good a job the local incumbent is doing, if they've kept tabs on their district and serviced their constituents.
Okay, I think there is one more question here. Please don't forget to send the link to the recording. Oh, that's for me. Okay, don't worry. I'll do that. This has been wonderful. Is there anything more that's come through? Yes, this other person just said, fabulous. Thank you so much. We've learned so much, and this is so current. We're going to have you back again in the fall, because other things are going to have happened already.
Well, we're not going to do a quiz now, but the primer I posted in 5 pages kind of summarizes in easier language, I hope, because I had someone else edit it and rewrite it, that will explain the whole process in a much easier way. But I did want to, but because we have the ability of a hour-long webinar, I took the time to really walk through each of the steps and put it in the big picture.
Mm-hmm. Well, also, please, I've gotten one email, I think, from you regarding some seminar you were doing or something. If anything else comes up that you are either doing or you think we should know about, you have my email.
The best thing right now is to find out when the visual hearing is taking place. And although you don't need to be an expert or have any data, if you think that your congressional, assembly, or Senate district needs to be maintained or changed, let the commission know, because it's important that the commission role play itself out, because if for any reason the commission process doesn't actually reach a real plan, the legislature may have only about a month to do all the work that usually it does in 9 months. So the hearing record that's built up now might be relied on by the legislature when it either evaluates commission plans or develops a plan of its own. We don't know that yet. This is a new process that has to happen. And I work for 4 processes, 3 of them working in the assembly majority, where we thought we could do no wrong. And then the last cycle in the Senate minority, where anything the Republicans did had to be bad. So I've looked at it from both perspectives.
Okay.
And now this is different. We have a commission that is not in contact with the state legislature. And the legislature is not, contrary to common gossip, behind the scenes drawing plans. Because if it became known they were doing that, then it would be that the Assembly and Senate just are, think that the commission is a waste of time. And they just put $4 million into it. So I just urge, each step of the way to participate, organize, educate, and get your point across.
Okay, and as speaking for the league, if there is anything that we definitely should be involved in, well, you do know we have our own committee on the census and redistricting. Please send the information. You can either send it to me, you have my email, or send it to Laura Puig, our program committee chair, and I'm sure we will all get involved and see how we can help. Okay. Anyway, this has been terrific. I see the praises coming in so much, and we really appreciate it.
Very much. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I will say goodbye now.
Okay, bye.
Okay, good night, everyone.